I am Refet Gürkaynak of Bilkent University and CEPR, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to ESSIM 2021. ESSIM is CEPR's great annual all macro together conference. And last year, for obvious reasons, we were unable to hold it. And this year it's online. And there's a wonderful lineup of papers, and even more wonderful lineup of authors. And we're looking forward to having a great policy relevance discussion of cutting edge macroeconomics. And the hope is this is going to be much more than yet another online conference. The plan is to have 3 plenary speeches every day, followed by 3 parallel sessions. The plenary sessions are going to be live streams. The parallel sessions are going to be recorded and then will be made available later. The authors are going to have half an hour to present, and then we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A session. If the participants in the Zoom session have clarification questions, you're welcome to jump in and ask your questions during the presentation, but please have a high threshold for what qualifies as a clarification question. You're always more than welcome to write questions in chat and raise your hand electronically in the Q&A period. I will be keeping an eye on the live stream too, and when people write their questions there, I will do my best to convey them here. That's more or less the plan, and remember that this is going to last from today till Friday. And once again, welcome all. There's going to be a minor change in the lineup. It's an ungodly hour in California, and Yuri hasn't shown up yet. So Veronica has gracefully agreed to be the first presenter, and therefore I turn the word over to her and look forward to hearing her paper. Go ahead.
Thank you. Perfect. Let me share my slides. All right. First off, thank you to the organizers for including this paper, COVID-19 and SME Failures, on the program. This is joint work with Pierre-Olivier Gornichat, Shebnem Kalan-Leoshchen, and Nick Sander. And of course, the usual disclaimer does apply. I will say, please jump in if you have any questions. I do not see the chat, so please, feel free to jump in at any time if you have any questions. So with that, let's get started. So this project is really motivated by the unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 crisis, and especially its potential impact on some of the most at-risk firms in the economy, small and medium-sized enterprises. And it is these SMEs that are especially vulnerable to a shock like COVID-19 because they tend to have lower cash buffers and more limited access to external finance. And so with a shock like COVID-19 that lowers a firm's cash flows, for some, this may trigger a liquidity shortage. Now, of course, for policymakers and researchers alike, there is a real challenge in trying to understand how at risk their economies are to a shock like COVID-19, and also a challenge in implementing and then subsequently evaluating different policies, because ultimately we lack real-time data on firm failures. And so that's precisely where this paper is going to try to play a role. We're going to use a combination of a model and detailed firm level data in order to estimate the impact of COVID-19 on SMEs. In particular, we're going to answer 2 questions. The first is, what is the impact of COVID-19 on SME failures in the absence of government intervention? Or put another way, how at risk are economies to a crisis like COVID-19? And then second, what is the cost and effectiveness of various government interventions that were aimed at saving these firms? Now, in the interest of time, I won't go into detail about the literature, but do want to recognize that our paper is contributing to a rapidly growing literature in both 2020 and now 2021 that was spurred by the COVID-19 shock, okay? And so with that little aside, let's jump straight into our methodology. So, as I mentioned, we can think of COVID-19 as being a shock that is quite complex in nature, in the sense that it's going to have both supply and demand components. But ultimately, COVID-19 is going to affect firms in many ways, and in one way in particular by lowering some of these firms' cash flows. Now, for some of these firms, this decline in cash flow can result in a liquidity shortage, meaning that the firm will not have enough cash plus cash flow under COVID-19 in order to cover its financial expenses. And therein lies the challenge. If you want to understand which firms are facing a liquidity shortage, the problem is we simply do not observe a cash flow in real time. And so the way that we overcome this in our paper is by combining detailed firm level data with a model to specifically estimate a firm's cash flow under COVID-19. So how do we do this? First, on the data front, we're going to use Bureau van Dijk's Orbis data, which is a representative firm level data set. And in particular, we're going to focus on the financial piece of that data, where we observe both balance sheet and income statement items of firms. We choose a sample of 17 countries, predominantly European countries, and we're going to focus on the latest data that we have available, which is for 2018. And so the way to think about our exercise, for you to believe our exercise, you have to believe that in these 17 countries, the 2018 financial data, the distribution of it is similar to what it would be at the end of 2019. And we think this is actually a reasonable assumption because most of these countries didn't face any large shocks in between 2018 and 2019. Really, COVID-19 was something that was a surprise, and it happened in these countries at the onset of 2020. On the model front, we're going to have a simple model. It's going to have a firm or firms that minimize over the labor and material costs, given a set of supply and demand shocks that are calibrated at the sectoral level and are meant to capture really important features of the COVID-19 crisis. And I'll talk about those in detail in the next slide. And from this model, we derive an estimating equation for the firm's cash flow under COVID-19. And it actually has a really intuitive interpretation. So a firm's cash flow under COVID-19 can be understood as its pre-COVID revenue adjusted for by the shock to that revenue coming from COVID-19, net of its labor and material costs in normal times, adjusted for by the shock to these costs that comes from COVID-19. And so what you see in this expression is two types of terms. You see your terms in green, which are revenue and cost of goods sold. And these are things that we can observe directly in the firm level data from Orbis. The second terms that you see are these in orange, and they represent a combination of supply and demand shocks that we're going to introduce that capture features of the COVID crisis. In particular, we're going to have in our model a firm I that operates in sector S, and it's going to face 4 shocks that I'm going to describe now. The first shock is one to the labor utilization constraint, or I'll refer to it more commonly as the labor supply shock. And all this is meant to capture is the fact that during the lockdown period when COVID-19 hit, due to workplace restrictions and social distancing requirements, firms were only able to hire up to a fraction, which we denote X hat S, of the workforce they would during normal times. And the way that we bring this to the data is by turning to the approach of Dingle and Neiman 2020, and we use ONET data in order to evaluate the feasibility of remote work at an occupation level. And then we aggregate based on the occupational distribution of sectors up to the sector level. The second shock is one to labor productivity. And here the way to think about it is that when the crisis hit, a lot of workers that used to work in an office all of a sudden had to transition to working remotely. And there was an initial phase of adjustment that may have lowered their productivity, their labor productivity. And that's what we're trying to capture with this shock. And so in particular, we adjust the productivity of remote workers down by 20%. Now, to be fully transparent here, the 20% is ad hoc on our part due to a lack of better data. But what we can say is that we've run a lot of exercises where we've played around with the size of the shock by how much we adjust labor productivity. And our results are not sensitive to this, to the value of this parameter. The last 2 shocks that a firm faces are to its demand. And a firm's demand has 2 key components. The first that we denote by psi hat is a sector-specific demand shock. And what it is capturing is the reallocation of demand that we see during COVID-19 away from things like restaurants towards things like online grocery stores. And the way that we bring this to the data is very similar to our labor supply shock, in the sense that we turn to the ONET data, and now we evaluate the reliance of different occupations on face-to-face interaction, and then we aggregate this up to the sector level. The final shock is one to aggregate demand, and we denote it by PD hat. And the aggregate demand shock affects all sectors in the same way. And what it is capturing in our framework are things that are largely unmodeled for us, in particular, general equilibrium effects and potentially things like precautionary savings. And to bring this to the data, we're going to use country level quarterly GDP growth forecasts from the IMF's June World Economic Outlook. Now, before moving on, I do want to recognize that just as occurred in reality, we are going to differentiate between essential and non-essential sectors. And so the thing to keep in mind about essential sectors is that we're going to assume that they do not face a labor utilization constraint. And due to the reallocation of demand, and this will be clear in the next slide, they are going to face the highest demand across sectors. And so to put this a little bit more visual, let's turn to the two key shocks that we have in our model, the labor supply shock and the sector-specific demand shock. So in this figure, what you see on the x-axis is one-digit NACE sectors. The y-axis is the size of the shock, and then you see two kinds of bars. The black bars are for one-digit NACE sectors that are predominantly composed of non-essential industries, and the orange bars are one-digit NACE sectors that are predominantly composed of essential sectors. And so what you see in the left figure that depicts the distribution of the labor supply shock is that, exactly as you would anticipate, labor restrictions are most severe in your service sectors like accommodation and food, and also in sectors where remote work really is difficult by the nature of work, such as mining. Then on the right side, what you see is this reallocation of demand that I talked about. So what you see is negative demand shocks in customer-oriented sectors like arts and recreation, and positive shocks. So demand is being redistributed towards sectors that are essential, such as manufacturing, construction, and health. And so with this framework in mind, we're basically ready to answer that first question. How at risk are economies to a shock like COVID-19? And to do this, we're going to specifically look at the SME failure rates in the absence of government intervention. Now, the first thing that we want to note in this table is in column 1, and it's what fraction of firms in the economy fail if COVID never happened. So column 1 tells you the normal time failure rate in our data, where the failure rate is defined by that liquidity criteria I introduced. In the second column, we're going to introduce a baseline COVID-19 scenario. And the way we do this is we say, at the end of February, we're going to have an 8-week lockdown because the COVID-19 shock hit. And during these 8 weeks, all 4 of those shocks that I described earlier are active. At the end of these 8 weeks, the labor supply shock and the productivity shock revert back to normal immediately, while the 2 components of the demand shock only revert back to normal slowly over time. We assume there's no government intervention to start. We evaluate our liquidity criteria at a weekly frequency. And the second column of this table reports the cumulative failure rate at the end of 2020. And the key column to look at is the third column, which is the difference between the second and the first column. And what it's telling you is what is the excess failure rate in these economies on average due to COVID-19 specifically. And so the first takeaway is that SMEs did face a risk from the COVID-19 crisis. Their failure rates in the absence of government intervention would have nearly doubled. Now, of course, the key thing that this table masks is a massive amount of heterogeneity. For example, there's a lot of heterogeneity across sectors, with a more essential sector like electricity facing only a 1.4 percentage point increase compared to a sector in the services area, such as arts, entertainment, and recreation, which experienced a 26 percentage point increase. Now, this cross-sector heterogeneity is naturally, through differences in industrial composition, going to feed into cross-country heterogeneity. And so here, to illustrate this point, I'm comparing 2 countries. Italy, which is depicted in red, and Slovakia, which is depicted in gray. And in the left figure, I'm plotting the evolution of the SME failure rates in these two countries. And in the right figure, the evolution of the total demand shock, which is composed of both the sector-specific demand shock and the aggregate demand shock. And what you see in the right figure of the failure rate evolution is that by the end of the year, Italy has nearly an 8 percentage point higher failure rate than Slovakia does. When you dig into the data, what you see is this is primarily driven by the fact that Italy faced a far more severe demand shock than Slovakia did. And this is of course going to in part be driven by differences in the industrial composition of these two countries, where Italy has its economy a bit more concentrated in sectors that are more negatively impacted by the COVID-19 crisis than Slovakia. But this industrial composition is not the only driver of cross-country heterogeneity that we observe in our framework. The second, is there a question? Okay. The second key driver of heterogeneity in our framework is financial vulnerability. And so to make this point, I'm going to keep with Italy, still depicted in red, and now look at France, which is now in gray. And what you see in the right figure is that by the end of 2020, there's a 5 percentage point difference in the failure rate between Italy and France. But if you look at the evolution of their total demand in the left figure here, it's actually quite similar, as is the evolution of their sector-specific labor supply shock. So what is the reason behind the difference in the failure rate? Well, when you dig into the data, it actually has to do with the financial vulnerability of firms entering the crisis. So what you see in the right figure is the evolution of the cash balance of these two countries. And what's clear from this figure is that firms in Italy throughout the crisis are far closer to their liquidity constraint than French firms are. So when they face the same shock, a lot more Italian firms are going to fail than French firms. And that's precisely what we see in our results. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about the risk that the economy faces directly from SME failures. But there is a spillover from SME failures to another area of the economy, in particular, the banking sector. And the way that this can arise is that when an SME fails, it's going to have non-performing loans that end up on the balance sheet of a bank. And so to assess whether or not SME failures are spilling over into potentially causing systemic risk in the banking sector, we look at the economy's tier one equity capital, common equity tier one capital ratio. And what we see is that on average, this ratio is around 14% at the end of 2018. And when we account for the non-performing loans that are arising from SME failures in our baseline scenario, that CET1 ratio declines by about 2 percentage points. And so we say in our paper that this is evidence of moderate, at most, systemic risk of SME failures under COVID-19 for the banking sector. And the reason we think it's only moderate is that we can turn to the EBA's 2018 stress test. And in their adverse scenario, they saw a 4 percentage point decline in the CET1 ratio, which is a little, is about twice as much as what we observe in our baseline scenario. Now, of course, up to now, I've been talking about that first question, which is abstracting from government intervention. And so now let me turn to the question of what is the cost and the effectiveness of various government interventions. Of course, governments intervened really rapidly in response to this crisis and implemented a wide array of policies. And they can be categorized into a lot of different buckets, but commonly governments implemented things like waivers, which could affect firms' taxes, financial expenses, rent. They implemented subsidies like the Solidarity Fund in France, or government guaranteed loans like the PPP in the United States. And to be super upfront about what we do in our paper, we don't take any single country's package of policies and evaluate it. Rather, what we do is we consider an array of individual policies that taken together broadly encompass the most commonly implemented policies in response to the crisis. And when we're thinking about the cost and the benefit of these different policies, we want to benchmark ourselves against something. And so we introduce a benchmark policy that assumes a government has all possible information. What does this mean? It means that they can do two things. First, a government can identify exactly the firms that are failing due to COVID. So these are firms that would have survived under a non-COVID scenario. And two, they know exactly how much cash needs to be transferred to these firms in order to have them avoid failure. And that's what they do. So this is a highly targeted policy that only saves at-risk firms and does it at the lowest possible cost. But of course, this is requiring of government something that is impossible, which is full information about firms. So we also consider an array of more realistic policies that ex post we end up grouping into two different categories. The first is moderate cost, moderate impact, meaning that the fiscal burden isn't super high. However, these policies don't save too many firms or jobs. And these tend to actually fall into rebate or waiver style policies. So things like waiving a firm's financial expenses, taxes, or rent. And the reason that taxes is highlighted here in green is this is the one that I'll talk about in the next slide. The second group of policies we consider as high cost, high impact. So they require a larger dispersal of funds, but at the same time are able to save substantially more jobs. And the kinds of policies that fall into this bucket tend to be injections of new funds. So things like subsidies, for example, or a government guaranteed loan. And so in our paper, the way we refer to this government guaranteed loan is as a pandemic loan. And the reason we chose it is because it replicates something similar to what was implemented in a variety of ECB countries. So it's a long-term loan, no interest, government guaranteed, and principal doesn't have to begin to be repaid until the start of 2021. In terms of the size of the loan, it's related to a firm's size. And the way that we operationalize it in our framework is we say that during each week of lockdown, a firm is going to receive the larger between 25% of its pre-pandemic revenue or 2 times its pre-pandemic wage bill. Now, the one thing to take away, and I think this should be clear from how I describe the pandemic loan, is that from the point of view of a firm, especially since it's not repaying anything on this loan until the start of 2021, the subsidy and the loan guarantee simply reflect, from the point of view of 2020, a transfer of resources to the firm, okay? Now on to what the impact of these policies is. So let's start with the benchmark policy, which is the one that we assume the government has just full information. The first thing is that less than 1% of GDP is dispersed. By construction in this policy, you are saving all of the firms that are failing specifically due to COVID-19. And in the process, you're saving over 4.6% of jobs in the economy. In contrast, in the second row, you see the rebate policy. It costs less than 1.5% of GDP, but at the same time saves very few firms and also saves less than 1% of jobs in the economy. In contrast, the pandemic loan that I described does a really good job of saving nearly as many firms as the benchmark policy, nearly as many jobs as the benchmark policy. But the key difference between the two policies is the funds dispersed. Rather than less than 1% of GDP under the benchmark policy, the pandemic loan requires a dispersal of over 5.8% of GDP. So of course, you would like as a policymaker to be able to save a bunch of firms and a bunch of jobs, but want to understand why you might be doing it at such a high, such a high cost or fraction of GDP. And so what we do in order to dig into what's causing this is we take our baseline no government policy scenario, and we can group firms into 3 categories. The first is a set of firms that simply survive COVID, and we think of these as strong firms. So they don't need government support in order to survive to the end of 2020. The second group of firms are weak firms. These are firms that fail under non-COVID and also fail under COVID. And the last group of firms are these at-risk firms that you ideally would want to target assistance towards. We call them viable firms, and they're the firms that only fail due to the COVID-19 shock. And there's several takeaways from this table. The first is that it is not the case that a lot of assistance is going towards weak firms. They account for less than 0.5% of the 5.8% of GDP that is dispersed under this policy. Rather, the vast majority of the funds are going towards strong firms.
But
Now,
Veronica,
yes.
can I ask you a question? Are
Absolutely.
firms obligated to take this loan, or can they self-select into accepting this loan?
So in this particular scenario, we do not allow firms to self-select. Everybody takes it up. And I think this is actually going to relate to kind of the good news bit of this policy, which is to say that you don't necessarily need to think of these 4.75% of GDP as translating to a fiscal burden onto the government, right? Why? Because even if we take this very extreme case where we have all of the firms take up the loan, we see in our companion paper that takes our scenarios through the end of 2021, that a lot of these strong firms are going to be in a good enough position in 2021 to start repaying their loan on time. So what this means is that ultimately, a fair share of this 4.75% of GDP of funds that are dispersed in this scenario are not going to necessarily translate into a fiscal burden on the government.
But if you gave them in this model, if you gave them the option to not take the government loan, what would they do?
Some of them would not necessarily take the government loan, but the truth is it gives them more funds. And if they anticipate that they would be able to repay the interest rate on there, it's a no interest loan. We anticipate that a fair share of them probably would. We haven't done that scenario exactly, but in 2020, it's helpful for them. They might anticipate that they'll be able to, repay it. It's not going to be too much of a burden on them. So some of these firms would definitely still take it up. So and you do see this in reality as well.
Let me jump in and say two things. One is you have 5 minutes, so you should perhaps speed up if you actually have 35 slides.
Oh no, I have 2 more slides.
Okay, very good. Then I could ask a question too. Are these ratios, so firms that survive get 4.75% of GDP, and the ones that we actually want to receive the funds get 0.6% of it. Is this essentially a statement about most firms would surprise COVID anyway? And since we are giving these loans to all firms, this is just an indication of how many firms would have failed without this. Is that more or less it?
Yes, I think so. Yes. And so the last point that I want to make in this potentially good news thing is that even if this wasn't a pandemic loan, even if this was a straight subsidy to firms, their government does have the opportunity to claw back some of this relief via additional policies such as a future excess profit tax. Okay. And the last bit about policy that I want to discuss is the implications of changing the timing and the size of policy support. So in this figure, you see 4 lines. The dashed black line is just our baseline scenario with no government policy support. Okay. Then the blue line that you see, this one right here, is the one that that is our baseline pandemic loan scenario, which I'm going to refer to as 8 weeks of support at 100%. And so what I mean by that is for 8 weeks of the lockdown, we transfer to firms, and I'll just use the wage part of our equation, 2 times their wage bill. And what you see is relative to the baseline, it lowers failure rates by 8.6 percentage points. And what's interesting when you look at it at a weekly frequency is that eliminates any rise in failure rates during the actual lockdown period. And what's nice is that through the end of the year, you actually end up at a failure rate that's quite similar to a normal time failure rate. Now in the red line, what we do is change the timing of the support. So now what we're dispersing is rather than 2 times your wage bill for 8 weeks, you get 1 time your wage bill for 16 weeks. Now for a subset of firms that would have survived until the 16 weeks, these 2 policies are going to result in the exact same dispersal of funds to firms. But for some firms that need the relief during the lockdown period, it's simply not going to be enough. And that's what you see with this rise in failure rates during the lockdown period when you change the timing of the support. Even though by the end of the year, you end up with a failure rate that's quite similar to our baseline pandemic loan scenario.
So now, when horizontal axis is weeks here, right?
I'm sorry?
The horizontal axis is weeks.
Oh, yes, sorry, thank you. This is yes, it is weeks. The horizontal axis is weeks. And so the last thing to note here is that when we actually dig into the data, what we see is that there is something important to keep in mind with when you change the timing. The types of firms that are most hurt by changing the timing from 8 weeks at 100% to 16 weeks at 50% are the viable at-risk firms, actually the exact firms that you would want to be saving with the policy. And the last policy that we consider is one where we take our baseline pandemic loan scenario, 8 weeks at 100%, and we simply extend it for an additional 8 weeks. And what you see here is that it continues to do the job. It continues to be beneficial to the economy to extend this relief beyond the initial 8-week lockdown period because it lowers the failure rate profile through the end of the year. And in this particular scenario, what ends up happening is you end up with a failure rate that's about 1 percentage point below normal times. And with that, let me briefly conclude the main lessons from our exercise. The first is that COVID-19 did in fact pose quite a risk to SMEs. Had governments not intervened, failure rates would have nearly doubled relative to normal times. That being said, even without government support, these SME failures through non-performing loans would not have posed much of a systemic risk to the banking sector. On the policy side, what we see is that if you were able to fully target just at-risk viable SMEs, it's pretty costly. I mean, it's pretty efficient to do so because it costs less than 1% of GDP and you save nearly 5% of jobs in the economy. However, more realistic transfers that save many firms may require a larger dispersal of funds. And then comes into play a discussion for policymakers about how to structure that relief, because you wouldn't want all of those funds to translate into a fiscal burden on the government. And so what we say in our paper at the end is that equity-like support, whether that equity-like support be structured in an ex-ante fashion or an ex-post fashion, with the ex-post example being something like an excess profit tax, these kinds of structures would best balance the tension between saving the viable firms that you ideally want to save and mitigating the potentially large fiscal cost that these policies could have otherwise. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion and feedback from the group. Does anyone have any questions?
Would you like to unshare your screen so that we get to see each other while having the general discussion?
Perfect.
Very good. Let me kick this off with a question of my own. First, appreciation. This really is a wonderful paper and well thought and obvious policy relevance. Now, the numbers say, you would spend less than 1% of GDP if you're able to target the at-risk firms and would have a huge bang for buck. Those all are contingent on the assumption of how long the lockdown lasts, right? How long this demand shock lasts for. And probably you actually have somewhere in these estimations some elasticity that says, 1 more week of lockdown, because I guess I'm asking this, for a average at-risk firm, you would have a hazard function that says, or even better, a density of hazard functions that say, so many firms will be able to survive for so many weeks based on their cash reserves. And then we'll begin to see at this rate of bankruptcies, right? And you would have elasticities to report based on, if I were able to select these firms, it would cost me this much either per firm or for some measure, right? If the lockdown lasts for this much longer, the support would have to last at least as long, and it would cost this much. And this is the function that says the cumulative support will have to be increasing because more and more firms will be depleting their cash reserves. Is it feasible to plot that function something like, if you wanted to save 5% of jobs, for example, right, and you are able to target the at-risk firms, then this is the cumulative that you have to spend. If you are unable to target, but still want to save 5% of jobs, this is what you have to spend as a function of the lockdowns.
So we haven't done that exactly. We have considered situations where we introduce additional lockdowns. So that is something that we have done. But I mean, the point is well taken. In principle, kind of that is certainly something that we can back out. And what I can say about sort of the second lockdown scenario is that, well, I would say kind of two things. Things that we would have to keep in mind in those scenarios is that some of those second lockdowns or the second waves of the crisis are not necessarily as large as they were before, and the lockdowns kind of last a shorter period of time. And so the transfers would have to last, less time. And so in the scenario that we do consider where we do exactly this, we do see that the continued support can continue to eliminate the rise in failure rates coming from these. But the actual numbers that you like, which is sort of how much, for an additional, if you have an additional week, how much more money, that we currently do not have in the paper. But, as you said, that is in our framework, something that we could definitely back out. And I appreciate that point because we can certainly look into it.
And then we have Francesco to ask a question.
Hi, Veronica. That's a very interesting paper. I have a question about just maybe I should start out with making sure I understood correctly. So did you assume that the instant that the cash flow falls below the financial obligations, that triggers bankruptcy?
Yes, in our baseline scenario.
Is that a realistic assumption? I mean, I think we even heard anecdotal stories of a lot of forbearance from creditors during at least maybe we heard less of that later, but at the beginning certainly you heard a lot of stories about creditors showing a lot of forbearance towards their companies. You can imagine workers being willing to work for free, delay wage payments. You heard stories about people who rent out houses, allowing people not to pay rent for a few months. So, I mean, aren't you depicting a situation that is more dangerous for firms than it actually is? I mean, isn't there quite a scope for slack in the economy for firms to kind of go several weeks or months in a situation where the cash flow is below the nominal financial obligation? That's question number one. I asked all my questions in one go, so I don't have to come back again. The other question is about the policies. I mean, I was trying to think, and maybe the answer is a very simple no, but is there a way of designing the loan scheme so as to elicit separation by the firms? For example, is there a, I understand that you design a completely interest-free loan, but is there a positive interest rate that discourages the healthy firms from applying for the loan, but still gives a chance to the unhealthy ones to say, yeah, we'll take this. It's going to cost us a bit, but it will help us survive.
Great. So let me answer your first question by saying sort of two things. I'm really glad that you brought it up because we do make some assumptions about the credit market. So basically the way to understand our baseline scenario is that we're assuming exactly as you said, that if you go below zero, if you reach your liquidity constraint in any week and you fall below it, in the extreme case, you fail. And what this does assume is that you don't have access to new credit markets, and it doesn't take into consideration these things that you said, the forbearance, potential rent waivers, etc. And so the way that we try to address this is we have an extension where we kind of go to the other extreme. We say, let's assume that the firm could smooth its cash flow throughout throughout the year in a variety of different ways. And kind of the one we had at the back of our minds is access to new credit, but it could be, a combination of the things that you mentioned as well. And so what we do in that case is we just evaluate the liquidity criteria at the end of the year, right? So it's if you were for a couple of weeks or even a couple of months below that zero, but by the end of the year, you end up positive, you would still survive. And what we see is that actually impacts failure rates by lowering them on average by about 2 percentage points. So rather than a 9 percentage point increase, it lowers it to about a 7 percentage point increase on average, which is to say that, yes, exactly, the way, as you said, it's going to have an impact, but it does not eliminate by any means the entire rise in the failure rates. So then on to your second one is, could we design a policy scheme in which we elicit separation? The answer is yes, we could. We have not yet. And what you would imagine is that you'd want to run the scenario forward through 2021. And the way we would be thinking about it is knowing that you have to pay interest on these, the firms that would be able to continue to pay interest on it and would still be fine might take it up, whereas firms where it would become more of a burden for them, it would not. And we'd have to extend the scenario to 2021 to kind of figure out which firms would choose whether or not to take it up. And we haven't played around with the interest rate policy, partly because in this part of the paper, we were trying to replicate the kinds of government loan guarantees that were implemented in practice. But certainly it's something that we could think about.
If can I also make a remark following up on Francesco's questions?
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Rafat. Yeah, so just the other point to note on the question of how tight the criterion is we apply the same criterion in non-COVID years as well. So in a sense, what we're really looking at is the change in the failure rates from a non-COVID year, where you also have this very tight criterion where you would fail as soon as you cannot meet your financial expenses, whether on a weekly basis or an annual basis, to what happens in a COVID year. So you might think of this as sort of looking as sort of a difference in difference. Now, on the second point, really the optimal policy in a situation like this is something like an equity injection. I mean, if you could provide equity to those firms that might need it, and then you're fine, and you get, if those firms don't survive, then you've lost what you put in there, but you've tried. And if they do, then you get a claim on future profits. And so the question is how to design something that will approximate an equity injection. I think the right policy would have this kind of feature. And so it's not clear to me that you could do this by just changing the interest rate, as opposed to maybe having a sort of very generous upfront pandemic loan type proposal, combined with some form of clawback of excess profits for those firms that do survive, that represent something like, approximate the dividend payment on this equity stake. So that's sort of how we've been thinking about this.
Excellent. Let me quickly convey a question from the live cast. Nuna Coimbra asks what I see as a nonlinearity question too, which is the notion of small impact on systemic risk seems predicated on the absence of other types of losses in banks' balance sheet on top of the estimated losses. No?
That's a fair point. What we were estimating is the impact the direct impact of the non-performing loans on the bank's balance sheet. That was, we were in this section of the paper, we're really focused on what is the impact of, how at risk are these SMEs. And then, kind of the follow-up is, given that these SMEs might have non-performing loans, what is the direct impact of these non-performing loans specifically on the banking sector, for sure, right, abstracting from other things.
Very good. And Luca Ricci will ask the last question.
Thank you. I had one question in the chat, but it was already answered. Two quick questions. One is, to the extent that some data is available on firm failures already, maybe from some papers or some central bank sites, I wonder if you had the chance to compare your results with the outcome. And the second question is whether you have a chance to assess network externality on the basis of pre-COVID networks among firms, probably at the sectoral levels. I mean, we heard that those were quite important. If my supplier fails, then I'm more likely to fail, that kind of effect. Thank you.
Great, thanks. These are great questions. Let me take your second one first, which is to say we recognize that this is super important, and it's actually something that is currently not in our paper, but it's something we're working on integrating. Precisely for the reason that you said, there's a bunch of literature that, especially during a crisis like COVID-19, is really highlighting the potential importance of that. So it's definitely something we're thinking about and we're working on implementing as we speak. And the second is on data availability. The answer is we haven't done these comparisons yet, but what you do see in our paper is we compare normal time failure rates that arise from our model or from our framework with those official ones from the OECD in the kind of pre-pandemic times. And there's a couple of things that we'd want to note about this. One, it's pretty hard to find data for SMEs specifically. And when we chose our liquidity criteria for failure, it's specifically and especially relevant for SMEs because larger firms may have other avenues at their disposal that make the liquidity criteria potentially not as relevant. And a lot of times these aggregate statistics are going to they're not going to be specific to a liquidity criteria. So we'll definitely look at that. I will say there is a paper, and it's not for European countries, it's for the United States, that has looked at some preliminary evidence on kind of across sectors failure rates. And what was nice, what we noticed is that in that paper, at least the ordering of the sectors was quite similar in terms of the failures. So we haven't dug into country specific stuff and are a little worried about the difference in the failure criterion. But some of the evidence that we've seen, at least qualitatively, the patterns look pretty similar from what we've seen.
Very good. And that then, let me check.
Right.
Very good, yes. That then concludes this paper, and that was a great start to a great conference. We're going to take a short break until the hour. And on the hour, we're going to get started if Yuri has arrived with him. If not, Hideki has kindly agreed to be the second presenter. See you then. And Lydia, could you stop the recording so that people can chat here?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is the Alessandra question, right? There should be some cleansing. And you don't want to throw good money after bad for them. But some firms should be receiving these effective subsidies. So how do you do the mechanism design so that this is best done?
So I might punt this to Pierre-Olivier, but I would just say that kind of your idea on the banking front is a different way of thinking about, a similar thing as we would with the equity-like support as well, right? That's another way of, especially if you not design it in an ex post way of like clawing back relief, but if you were able to design it in an equity-like support way ex ante, I think that would sort of help with some of those concerns. But I'll leave this one to Pierre-Olivier.
Well, I would just offer one remark. I mean, it's sort of pitching a little bit our other paper on the same topic. I mean, in that other paper that Veronica mentioned during the presentation, we also try to look at what happens in 2021. And so if you're worried that somehow there are a lot of zombies out there, and let's say 2019, and then 2020 comes along and they all get this very juicy support, and they can sort of survive very nicely. And then you might be concerned that going into 2021, when the support is withdrawn, that's when you get this wave of business failures. You've just delayed something that is maybe inevitable, maybe both for some of the firms hit by COVID, but also for the ones that should have failed in normal times and maybe we're sort of carried along by the same wave of support. And so we, in that, just very briefly, we use the same analysis, but we extend what we did to a second lockdown, and then we look at what happens in 2021 when the support is withdrawn and the loans have to start to be repaid. And the surprising result we have there is we don't find that there is all of a sudden a surge of business, small and medium enterprise failures in 2021. The numbers are barely above the sort of normal year numbers, a little bit above, but not a whole lot. And we calibrate, and that goes back to what Luca was asking earlier, we calibrate the support provided in 2020 so that on average, failure rates in 2020 were also not more elevated, which is consistent with a lot of sort of indirect evidence, not very firm, very solid evidence yet, but indirect evidence that the failure rates have not been, certainly not been surging, and how much they decline, if they've declined, is still unclear.
Okay, now we may go back to our regular well, not exactly a regular program, but at least we may go back to the program. Since Yuri isn't here, Hideki Nakamura has gracefully agreed to be the second presenter. And therefore, Hideki, the floor is yours. Once again, half an hour for presentation with clarification questions and then 15 minutes of Q&A. By all means, go ahead. You should be able to share your screen. Right. And you are muted, so you should remember to unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Yes. This is the joint work with Joseph Zehler. Today, instead of him, I speak. Although I'm not good at English, I'll do my best. These are contents. Okay, the main goal of this paper is to examine the effect of automation on unemployment. It combines a task-based model of automation and with an expanding variety model. In this model, the main result is as follows. Although automation creates unemployment owing to the replacement by machines, in the long run, this unemployment converges to zero. This holds in all cases of the model, but to cases with probability zero. I explain our mechanism intuitively. Consider two cases, bounded and unbounded automation. If automation is bounded, new automation converges to zero, and thus the unemployment due to automation eventually goes to zero. Next, if automation is unbounded, a necessary condition is that wages rise. Just a moment. As machines become increasingly expensive. Wages rise if labor tasks increase, so that labor in each task is declining. Under the increase in labor tasks, less workers work in tasks which are newly automated. Hence, unemployment due to automation is falling. We have two additional contributions. The first contribution is that by combining automation and the variety expansion, we show that the two technical processes are related. For continuing automation, new tasks have to arrive sufficiently fast. The second contribution is an additional mechanism of increasing demand for labor by automation. If automation is unbounded, then new labor tasks have to be added, and that increases demand for labor. This is not assumed exogenously, but it is a necessary prerequisite to continuate automation. As related literature about new tasks creation and automation, I pick up Asmore Restrepo's study because it's a pioneering study. They demonstrate that in a stable BGP, new tasks creation and automation go hand in hand. In their model, under tasks replacement, increasing demand for labor depends on rising labor productivity over tasks. As a result, the number of labor tasks remains constant with continuing automation. Hence, unemployment remains at the BGP, I mean in interior BGP. In this figure, tasks normalized to be unity move to the right-hand side with higher indexed tasks, including rising labor productivity. And in the BGP, the number of replaced tasks and that of automated tasks and that of new tasks are equal in the model. On the other hand, this study shows unemployment declines with continuing automation. So the main difference between these studies is the mechanism we introduce that tasks need to grow fast to enable continuing automation. And that increases demand for labor. As a result, because of an increase in labor tasks, less workers working automated tasks. Empirical studies report positive, negative, and insignificant effect of automation on employment. Hence, I and Joseph believe our study does not contradict some of empirical studies. And you know, there are also many studies that examine automation, wages, and growth. Because of not enough time, I skip the other papers.
Hideki, can I ask you a question, clarification?
Yes.
You're describing a world in which the notion of continuing automation requires always new tasks to be created, because otherwise there would be no task to automate it, I guess. But the question I have is, are you assuming something about the difficulty or lack thereof for workers to learn new tasks? I mean, usually we think that as we introduce increasingly sophisticated tasks in the economy, workers are subject to increasingly demanding cognitive challenges to become expert at performing these tasks. From what you say, it sounds like you are assuming that these challenges can be overcome by everybody. That there are no workers who at some point are confronted with cognitive challenges that are insurmountable for them.
You are right, but we don't consider that in this paper. Actually, in this study, we consider the total number of tasks exogenously. We focus to have continuing automation in equilibrium. We find new tasks increases fast. So in that sense, we exogenously assume workers can deal with new tasks. Is that okay? Okay, then I move next. So okay, let's say our model. The production function of the final good is assumed to be CES type. So and the XTJ represent intermediate of task J. So you know the elasticity substitution is 1/1 minus theta. So I mean the elasticity substitution among tasks. And we focus on the main tasks. So we interchangeably use tasks and the intermediate goods. So in this model, tasks or intermediate goods between 0 and M are performed by machines. Tasks between M and T are performed by labor. Of course, later we'll check that equilibrium. And each unit of labor produces 1 unit of tasks. And each unit of an automated task J is performed by a machine of size Kj. This is an increasing function. This assumption of increasing function can be relaxed. We assume theta being greater than 0. It's required if producers can decide on which tasks to use. We make 3 assumptions about technical change. Assumption 1, producers choose freely which intermediate goods to use. Assumption 2, innovation do not disappear. Hence, the number of mechanized tasks M and the total number of tasks T are non-decreasing over time. The assumption 3, new automation is not invented if it's not adopted by producers. Hence, to some extent, automation or increasing automation is endogenous. So,
can I ask you to go back one slide?
Yes.
I don't understand what this first assumption means. You had a CES production function, which said basically you need to use all these tasks to produce output. What does it mean to choose? And then
yes, this means perfect substitutability between labor and machines for producing intermediate goods. So from the cost minimization, producers can choose which labor or machines are used. Okay. So our focus is to examine unemployment. Overlapping generations where people live 2 periods supply 1 unit of labor each period. All generations are of size half. Hence, the total supply of labor is 1. If a task becomes automated in period T, replaced workers who are young in period T-1 experience unemployment. Hence, we focus on unemployment, which is due to automation only. So a kind of technological unemployment caused by automation. We assume a small open economy. The gross interest rate is R. We also assume perfect competition and free entry. So let's check equilibrium condition. The profit of producers can be represented as follows. Small p is the price of intermediate goods J. So we can obtain the first order condition with respect to the quantity of each task xtj. We substitute this first order condition in the marginal profit of T. So it means the first derivative of the profit of producers with respect to T. So under theta being greater than 0, producers use all tasks, namely all intermediate goods. Hence, we assume theta being greater than 0. It means in the final good production function, the elasticity substitution is greater than unity. Hence, we consider variety expansion. So let's check good market equilibrium condition. We next substitute the first order condition xtj in the production function of the final good. We obtain the following equilibrium condition. So because we assume linear production function of machine use with machine's cost, the amount of machine's cost, kj, hence prices of automated intermediate goods, ptj, is equal to r times kj. And the prices of labor-produced goods is just W. For simplicity, we do not assume different productivity among tasks. Hence, the equilibrium wage rate satisfies the following. first of all, to see wage rate equation, we define a function phi of automation M, which is increasing and concave. And then by using this definition, we can rewrite the goods market equilibrium condition. Now we can obtain the proposition 1. In equilibrium, we always have phi m less than r theta over 1 minus theta. So yeah, the proof is as follows. If phi m greater than this function of r, prices of automated goods are lower than cost. This contradicts free entry and the perfect competition. If equal, wages is infinite and all people are unemployed. Hence, they might offer to work for lower wages. Then it might even be not profitable to use machines in many tasks.
Hideki, can I ask you to explain what proposition 1 says in words? What does it mean, this proposition? Why is it important?
Yes, actually, in this model, phi m function phi m has the upper bound. This upper bound is this function of r. So this proposition means in a finite time, phi m never reach its upper bound. Asymptotically, there is just a possibility phi m asymptotically approach its upper bound.
So phi m from the expression above is some measure of the capital stock in the economy. Is that
yes?
correct?
Yes. Actually, later you can get intuitive interpretation of phi m. Actually, phi m is closely related to labor share and capital share. Please, please check it later.
And what is capital R again?
Yes, R is interest rate, gross interest rate. And in this model, because of the small open economy, large R is exogenously given. Okay. Yeah, later we can see its meaning in more detail. So from the equilibrium condition above and from proposition 1, the equilibrium wage rate can be represented as follows. In the numerator of this wage equation, T minus M, it's the number of labor tasks. So the wage rate depends positively on the number of labor tasks. So it means under more labor tasks, less workers work in each task. So their marginal productivity is higher, and so is the wage. So we next turn to find the meaning of the denominator in this equation, 1 minus the function of R phi m. So using the first order condition and the wage rate, actually the share of labor, WE, E is total number of employment. WE over Y is equal to 1 minus R to minus theta over 1 minus theta phi m. So the share of capital, if this function of R times phi m. So of course, in equilibrium, these two shares are between 0 and m. So this proposition 1 means yes.
Let me remind you that you have 10 minutes to go.
Yes. So, okay. So let's say the adoption of automation. So because we assume perfect substitutability between capital, machines, and labor in the intermediate goods, automation technology is adopted only if wages exceed cost of machinery. So in this figure, I illustrate this condition. So from the tasks 0 to m, machines is cheaper. So hence we have automation. But from m and t, machine is more expensive, labor is cheaper, or machine technology doesn't exist. Therefore, we use labor. Substituting the wage equation into this condition, we get the relationship between T and M. So actually, depending on the machine's cost K, there are 3 cases. First, denoted as A. So in this case, so as noted in the proposition 1, the upper bound of phi m is R to theta over 1 minus theta. And if machine's cost is large, we have case A. So it means the limit of phi m is less than the upper bound. And in case B, it asymptotically converges to its upper bound. And in case C, it hit with finite m. So it means bounded automation in case C. So it occurs when machine's cost is small. And case A occurs, case A means possibility of unbounded automation. And in case A, in the long run, we have a positive share of labor. And the proposition 1 means, we have, in case C, we have just bounded automation. But even in this case, it asymptotically approach its upper bound. It never hit finite time. So it's the proposition 1. Of these 3 cases, case B is knife edge case. So we focus A and C. Of these 2 cases, in case A, automation is unbounded. The labor share converges to positive value with long run. In case C, automation is bounded. Even in this case, long run growth is possible by an increase in capital input. However, the labor share converges to 0, which might be unrealistic. Therefore, we focus on case A. And so by investigating this automation condition, we have proposition 4. Actually, this means in the plane of T and M, we can illustrate convex function implied by the condition of automation. So it means given T, M is bounded. Thus, for continuing automation, T must increases faster.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you. I don't think you said anything about how capital T changes. What is the mechanism that leads to increases in capital T, in the big T?
Yes. So
what is the mechanism for that?
So So actually, that's a point in this study. So automation adoption requires wages should increase above the cost of machines. Wages increase if the number of labor tasks increases fast. Then labor in each task declines and the marginal productivity increases. So for continuing automation, the total number of tasks T must increase fast.
Yeah, that's clear, but what is it in the model that makes it increase?
Model.
Is there an R&D sector in the model?
Yes. So we exogenously consider T's increase. Yeah, we do not consider the mechanism was sector for producing T.
Okay.
Yeah, it's possible to endogenous T. But for simplicity, we do not consider endogenous T in this study. So I'm not sure. Okay, we see unemployment. If task J becomes mechanized in period T, workers who become unemployed are the old who worked there in period T minus 1. So in this figure, the tasks between MT minus 1 and MT are replaced by machines. So those workers are replaced by machines. And in each task, the labor amount can be calculated by the second equation. Small l, large E is total number of tasks. And then we can calculate the number of unemployment from MT minus 1 to MT. But the old exits the labor market. Hence, we consider inequality. It's difficult to calculate the exact number.
Hideki, you should be slowly wrapping up.
Yes. So, So because T minus M increases in unbounded case, hence we have convergence of unemployment to 0 in long run. In the case of bounded automation, it's obvious no unemployment in the long run. So actually, we had just 1 point. We also examined a closed economy. If the discount rate is sufficiently high, case A holds. The result remains unchanged. And we examined some numerical examples. The left-hand side figure shows the decline of unemployment rate to convergence 0. And the right-hand side shows the convergence of share of labor. It does not converge to 0. It's converged to a positive value. Of course, it depends on the parameters, but we can easily find convergence above half. And if we consider share of labor with structure, we can obtain more stable share of labor. So the main message of the model is when we allow for creation of new tasks, they must be created and fast. If automation continues, that increases demand for labor and reduces unemployment as a result. Okay, maybe time is up.
Very good, thank you. So if you could please unshare your slides.
Yes.
Excellent. So once again, let me start the discussion off by asking a question myself.
Yes.
This result hinges on the assumption that we will be on a balanced growth path, right? It's on a cyclical macro, from a cyclical macro perspective, we do two kinds of things. One is to say, surely there's going to be a unique bounded solution. Let's find what that is. And then we'll be on that stable arm, so to speak. But then there's another question that we often ask, which is, what is the global stability properties of this system? And every now and then the answer turns out to be, well, it's not all that stable. And if you're not already at steady state, things don't look up for you. So here, it seems like this rests on the Acemoglu-Restrepo idea that if you are to have a balanced growth path, you have to have this expanding number of tasks. But in a sense, you are assuming the existence of the balanced growth path, that we will be on a balanced growth path. And based on that, it then implies unemployment will go to 0. One could also ask, what if this wasn't an assumption? but something to be studied, right? Assume that we don't have to be on a balanced growth path, and tasks therefore don't have to increase. In that world, would we expect to ever go back to something that resembles a balanced growth path? Is this in a global stability, from a global stability perspective, it's a stable world? Is there any way to answer that question?
Yes. So, yeah. First of all, yeah, in this model, actually, we study convergence to balanced growth path. So if time goes to infinity, we can go to BGP path, and depending on the machine's cost function KJ, we have different paths to the balanced growth path, and in case A, it means if machine's cost is large, then in this model we can surely have convergence to the balanced growth path, in which long run unemployment is 0. So I think our model is stable. Given the machine's cost function, any convergence path is stable.
Okay. So we have a question from Chiara Ospat. Would you go ahead and ask yourself?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking, sorry. I was thinking also that you need to assume that those new tasks, labor tasks, cannot be provided remotely, say from another country, no? Engineering, monitoring machines, and so on.
Yes. Yeah. In this model, we do not consider how new tasks are created. So we just show for continuing automation, new tasks must increase faster, but we don't give any mechanism for creating new tasks. So you are right. We should consider in the real world we need to put some resources to create new tasks. But in this model,
no, but I was thinking more of the unemployment rate. The unemployment link will depend on will you hire domestically or foreign? No? You need some restriction there. Yeah.
Sure. I agree with that.
All right, Francesco.
Hideki, I am still kind of struggling a bit to understand the mechanics of the model.
Yes.
You said that the expansion in the number of tasks is an exogenous process.
Yes.
But you also seem to have derived some restrictions that you have to impose on that process, because you said that for automation to continue, the process of task creation must become faster and faster.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess I don't quite understand how does that square with saying that the process is exogenous. It seems like you are deriving endogenously the path of the number of tasks. But more importantly, Can you try to explain again the intuition for why indefinite automation requires accelerating task creation? I just don't get the intuition that relates the process of automation to the speed of task creation.
Okay, so okay, there are some reasons for automation. One of the reasons is larger wage. If wages are expensive, we introduce machines. So, okay, then next, when wages increase. So in this model, when the number of labor tasks increases, then wages rise. It's because larger labor tasks means less number of workers in each task. So it causes increasing labor productivity. So in this model, for continuing automation, wages should rise. So for increasing wages, the number of labor tasks should increase. So it means the number of total tasks should increase faster.
This is the balanced growth path assumption that makes employment not go to zero, right?
Yes.
Hideki, actually, thank you. That was really helpful. And actually, it's a very interesting insight that you're saying, because you're basically saying automation is usually understood as a replacement of labor because labor is becoming expensive.
Yes.
Now, what you're saying is that basically automation sows the seed of its own demise in some sense, because if it was true that automation was depressing wages, it would be also at the same time removing the reason for further automation. If automation makes labor cheap, then why should you continue to automate? So I think that's a very, very interesting insight of your model. But of course, I think immediately there is a rejoinder, which is the reason why we are automating so fast right now is not so much that wages are increasing, but that the cost of automation is collapsing so fast. It's technological change that makes the cost of automation fall even faster than any adverse effect on wages. And so if that mechanism is the real world mechanism, your very optimistic story is harder to kind of embrace.
Yes. So in this study, we exogenously consider machines cost. So as you said, alternatively, we can consider machines cost declines, then automation can occur. And in this model, we can consider declining machines cost. So if machines cost declines, then automation unemployment temporarily increase. So we have both.
If you had a constant rate of decline in the cost of machines,
yes.
Couldn't you potentially reverse your result that unemployment is never goes to, it declines?
Actually, in that case, in this model, we have bounded automation. So unbounded automation is impossible. If machines cost declines over time, then unbounded automation is impossible we have bounded automation.
Can you explain why?
All right, can I stop this and move to the next question? Yeah, thank you. And Estafaya is next.
Yeah, so I think it was an interesting conversation. I think Francesco put it very nicely, but just one quick comment to Francesco. I'm not sure that the capitalists that decide to automate ask permission to the workers whether they're happy about their wages or not. I guess they automate because they have other profits. But I agree with you that the wages might not be the only reason. Now, just now to my question, I mean, it seems to me that the model has a very simple testable implication. I mean, we have a lot of data, occupational data, like ONET and various other OECD data. So the immediate testable implication would be to see whether the number of tasks has increased over the years, and most importantly, whether the number of complex tasks has offset the number of routinary tasks. I mean, part of the fact that the tasks have to increase is what Refet was saying, that it is assumed ex ante that we need to be on a balanced growth path. But this is not obvious. I mean, even when Keynes said that labor hours were going to decline, I mean, that's not obvious that we have to be on that path. And if we really have to be on that path, why couldn't it be there with another factor of production, like intangible? Why it has to be workers that bring us there?
Yes. So yeah. So yeah. Yeah, we need some empirical facts about increasing number of tasks. But one of fact is we now have many number of job titles. So according to the Canadian government, we now have job titles more than 35,000. So I think it means the number of tasks has been increasing. And for producing agricultural goods, agricultural foods from the ancient period, there remains tasks. And I think because of the variety number of agricultural goods, the number of tasks have been increasing. Do I answer Easter's question? I'm sorry, I can't catch exactly.
You answered.
Well,
thanks a lot.
Yeah, and there is more to be talked about, but we shall move on to the next presentation. So we're going to have again, change in the program since Yuri isn't here. Michael Weber very kindly agreed to step in and present here rather than in the monetary economics parallel session. Just to be clear, this is not Michael presenting the paper that Yuri would have presented. This is Michael presenting the paper that he would have presented later today in the monetary economics session. But hopefully this is going to be as of broad interest on monetary policy and heterogeneous impacts on the labor markets. If you're interested in this, you will also be interested in the next paper in the monetary economics program, where Estafaya is going to talk about heterogeneous labor market effects over business cycles. On that note, before we go ahead and have Michael speak, remember that when you were signing up for this conference, you chose a parallel session that you were interested in. And we go to the breakout rooms, you will automatically be directed there. If you find yourself in the wrong room, which isn't monetary economics, you're welcome to leave the breakout room. You will be in the general room where Lydia is going to welcome you and direct you into the correct room that you want to be in. All right. With that, Michael, and with thanks for stepping up, the floor is yours. And if you're unmuted, we would even hear you.
So thanks a lot for putting our paper on the program. This is joint work with Nithai Beckman at Tel Aviv University and David Matza at Northwestern. And yeah, I hope Yuri is well. I heard from him yesterday by email and he seemed well and alive. So let's hope for the best. So what I want to do is actually start off with a quote from the last year's Jackson Hole Economic Policy Symposium, where Chairman Powell said that with regard to the employment side of their mandate, they actually also changed that in addition to moving to average inflation targeting, and they now redefine maximum employment as being a broad and inclusive goal. And now, of course, the highlight here in red is done by us, that this new goal is reflecting the appreciation that for the benefits of a strong labor market, it's particularly good for many in low and moderate income communities. And effectively, what we want to understand is whether monetary policy indeed potentially has a heterogeneous effect on different subparts of the labor market. And I think it's fair to say that, for most of the literature, monetary policy is actually typically also in practice focused on overall labor market statistics. But we of course know from somewhat parallel literature, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in the average attachments of different subpopulations when it comes to employment statistics. And there's also a little bit of literature that argues that it is especially the low attachment parts of the labor force that might actually only enter into the labor force or into employment in tight compared to slack labor markets. Think about like the literature on ranking effects that started in the early mid-90s. Now, what we want to understand and argue is that this new broad-based and inclusive goal potentially might in fact actually require tight labor markets, which is also kind of alluded to by Chairman Powell, and given the new focus on especially if calling full employment when even less attached parts of the population have entered the labor force, we might actually in fact need a kind of lower for longer type of policy stance. And that's effectively also what Lena Brainard said, I think 2 years ago, that when she said, well, look, this preemptive raise in interest rates in 2015 potentially was a mistake because, it was exactly the time when maybe less advantaged groups actually started to enter the labor market. But actually, at least according to our reading of the literature, so far there's actually very little and no systematic evidence on the heterogeneous impacts of monetary policy on different subpopulations of the labor market, but crucially also whether indeed like the tightness of the labor market might be a mediating factor for the effect of monetary policy. And we want to actually look at that both first empirically and then through a simple, I don't know whether that's maybe too far-fetched heterogeneous New Keynesian model, but the heterogeneity is actually different from what you might actually have in mind. And so let me just tell you in the paper, in a slide, and then go into more details what we do empirically. So first, we actually want to study the employment growth of certain demographic groups in local labor markets in certain industries. And specifically, when I talk about that, so I have specific demographic groups in mind. So we want to stratify the data by race, education, and gender. Then actually we also want to focus on employment growth in certain industries. So here we focus on 4-digit NAICS industry codes. And then we also want to actually study the heterogeneity by local labor markets. And so I'll be more precise how we do that in a second, but think about like a little bit less than 900 local labor markets. And this panel structure actually then allows us to impose a pretty tight set of fixed effects that hopefully actually makes any type of alternative explanation potentially driving these effects less likely. And then effectively, we gain identification of comparing for the same demographic group within the same industry and within the same local labor market, the differential employment growth to the identical monetary policy shock in tight versus slack labor markets. And what I'll show you in a few slides is that actually it seems to be the case that it is the least attached subpopulations, Black, less than college educated, and women compared to white, college-educated and men, and those are average statements that actually seem to benefit more within industry and local labor markets in tight versus slack labor markets. And then what we do, we write down a simple New Keynesian model in which we have heterogeneous workers that differ in their idiosyncratic productivity. On the one hand, to understand like the mechanisms through which potentially these effects might materialize, but then also to study a few counterfactual analysis, what happens if we move from strict to average inflation targeting, what's happening if we had a flatter Phillips curve and things like that. So briefly to the literature, there are a couple of strands of the literature we talked to. So there's recent literature that also has been growing on the distributional effects of monetary policy. I talked briefly about the different cyclicality of different subpopulations, typically studied just across business cycles, not in response to monetary policy. I alluded to, in general, ranking effects in labor markets, but also this very active literature introducing unemployment in the standard New Keynesian model. And then, to the extent you want to call our heterogeneity as or abbreviate with an HA, you can also potentially think about Hank models, but I want to actually be very upfront. So, the typical amplification mechanisms like, incomplete markets and assets of different liquidity are not in the model, but we think actually potentially incorporating them to the extent we want to actually set equal less attachment in the labor market to higher marginal propensities to consume. We would think actually this mechanism might even be stronger. Actually, one paper I want to highlight, that's a very nice recent job market paper coming out of Berkeley by Beck that studies somewhat related questions, but focuses on optimal monetary policy in this setting. So let me briefly talk a little bit about the data. So here we have quarterly data for at the local labor market levels from the quarterly workforce indicator program from Q1 of 1990 to Q1 of 2019 for 895 local labor markets. Particularly, we have 380 MSAs and 15 micropolitan statistical areas. I might later on just refer to them as MSAs, but you know what I'm referring to. And then, as we discussed earlier, we want to then look at different subpopulations stratified by race, white versus black, education, high school dropouts, high school, some college and college educated, and then men versus women within a given 4-digit NAICS industry code. And here, so I should actually mention that whenever any of those cells has less than 50 observations, we would actually drop it from our data set. It's actually only a handful of observations, but leads to the fact that we also, at the end of the day, we have to drop Washington, D.C., because there we pretty much only have government employees. Now, in terms of then the way we measure our outcome variable, it's employment growth in the quarter after the monetary policy shock up to the quarter 4 quarters after the shock. Now, this is our baseline. We're also currently incorporating longer horizon effects for employment growth into the paper, but they haven't made it there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we want to understand whether the local labor market tightness is actually a mediating factor for potential differential effect of monetary policy on the employment growth of different subpopulations within industry. And so what we do here, we measure local labor market tightness by the ratio of the employed to the population within a local labor market, and for everyone between 25 and 54. Now, of course, ideally, we would want to have at the local labor market level measures of vacancies to unemployment ratios, potentially to measure tightness. We don't have the data, but we can show that actually our a measure of tightness is highly correlated, at least with, in the aggregate, with a measure of vacancy to unemployment. Now, in terms of monetary policy, so here we have a quarterly panel. So the first thing we do, given that we have width and fixed effect, we also just use the average effective Fed funds rate over the course of the quarter. Now, of course, you could still be concerned that potentially, even though we absorb any type of location, industry, time-specific trends, that monetary policy might still have an endogenous effect. There might be ultimately, endogenous. So therefore, we also use Fed funds futures based one-time policy shocks. So here we follow some of Ray Fed's earlier work, narrow event window, plus minus 10, plus 20 minutes, scaled change in the Fed funds futures around FOMC policy announcements, and then actually instrumenting the Fed funds rate with those high frequency based shocks. Today, I show you results using the average effective Fed funds rate, but actually in the paper we show that both the reduced form and also like the instrumented specification result in very similar effects. In fact, actually the two-stage least squares effect are slightly larger, which potentially could be consistent with employment growth being more pro-cyclical in slack versus tight labor markets, but we haven't actually systematically studied that. Now, I was alluding to earlier that different subpopulations have just a differential average degree of labor force attachment. And so here we just want to actually show that this is also true in our data. So if we compare the employment to population within blacks versus whites, we see this differential of a little bit less than 6 percentage points. We see it's monotonically increasing by official degrees of education, and it's also actually higher for men relative to women. So now empirically what we want to do, we want to take those groups we saw on the previous slide, call them G, and then run a simple OLS specification where on the left-hand side we have the employment growth for a certain demographic group G in industry J for digit NAICS code, the local labor market M, at time T, and remember how we define it. So if the shock occurs in quarter T, this is the employment growth from quarter T plus 1 to quarter T plus 4. And then we actually, the main coefficient of interest is actually the interaction, the estimate of the interaction term of the Fed funds rate interacted with our local measure of labor market tightness, employment to population ratio, which we lag by a quarter. We also have it in there by itself. And then here, I alluded to them earlier, we have I think actually pretty tight set of industry and time fixed effects. So we have like this theta here is an industry by local labor market fixed effect. So effectively you can think of it like, it allows us to, suck up any type of variation that is specific to a certain industry across the labor market. So therefore think about like, potentially, I don't know, the local supply of human capital or the quality of the transportation system. We also have industry by quarter fixed effects. So here you could think of it like, we effectively keep constant, aggregate demand for given industry's output or any other unobserved industry-specific temporal variation in employment growth that is actually common across the industries. And then when it comes to standard errors, we cluster them at the local labor market level, but clustering like at the quarter and local labor market level actually leads to a similar influence. So now let me show you a couple of results. So here I only report for gravity, like the estimate of the coefficient for the interaction term. So here you see like a negative number minus 0.45 for blacks relative to minus 0.06 for whites. That is not statistically significant. Here in square brackets, this is just the p-value of the difference of the coefficient. So here you see like it's the coefficient of the interaction term is statistically significantly different for blacks versus white. And so what the way to interpret this coefficient minus 0.45, if you are willing to move a 1 standard deviation decrease in the Fed funds rate, this would actually go hand in hand with a greater employment growth within industry in tight versus slack labor markets for blacks. In particular, it would result in a 0.37 percentage point increase if you move from a slack to a tight labor market, which is actually about 11% of the mean employment growth of blacks in our sample. As we already said, there's no differential growth for whites comparing tight versus slack versus tight labor markets, and also this difference is highly statistically significant. Now the structure of the tables will be identical. We just look at different subpopulations now. So here we just stratify the data by education. So similar results to before. If you now focus on column 3 here, this is the estimate for the interaction term for less than college educated. It's negative, statistically significant. And here we compare the difference relative to those that have a bachelor degree or higher levels of formal education. And so again, if you take this thought experiment, let's look at a 1 standard deviation decrease in the Fed funds rate. This would actually correspond to a 0.24 percentage points increase in employment growth if you move from a slack to a tight labor markets if you are less than high school educated or high school dropouts. Again, in terms of actually magnitudes, it's about 35%. This is pretty big of the average employment growth during our sample. And then the last difference here, we just split the data by gender. So here we see that for women, we see a higher employment growth to expansionary monetary policy in tight relative to slack labor markets. And again, we see no differential employment growth for male employment if you compare tight versus slack labor markets. The difference is again statistically significant in terms of magnitudes. The same 1 standard deviation decrease in the Fed funds rate results in an increase of 0.17 percentage points, moving from the 90th percentile to the 10th percentile of labor market tightness. And this corresponds to about like a 9% move of the average employment growth in our sample for women. So now actually let me move on and tell you a little bit of the model that we want to actually then simulate and understand actually whether pretty simple model can potentially rationalize some of the findings we see in the data. So we have pretty standard New Keynesian models, with the only difference is that workers differ in their type. And when I say differ in their type, they have a type-specific productivity shock, that is IID, and I'll be a bit more precise in a second. Workers can be separated for 2 reasons. At the beginning of the period, a fraction theta of workers is exogenously separated. Another fraction is actually separated endogenously. I come to that in a second. Then we have an aggregate and a worker-specific productivity. And as we discussed, like workers differ in their idiosyncratic productivity, which just for tractability, right now it's IID over time. We're working actually currently on extending the model to have persistent types. And then on the household side, other than that, it's pretty straightforward and standard in the sense that utility is separable between consumption and disutility of work. And to get some nice hump shapes and impulse response functions, consumers have habit formation in their preferences. And we also have and this is I don't know what you want to call it, like a modeling device similar to Ravenna and Walsh. So we have we separate intermediate and final goods firms just to uncouple wage and price setting decisions. Now, in terms of the timing, the beginning of the period, a fraction theta between 0 and 1 is exogenously separated from the firm. Then aggregate productivity materializes, that is common knowledge to everyone in the economy. Then we have worker-specific productivity. As we said, it's IID, and it's observable for the firm if it's actually employing a certain worker. It's not observable to the firm if the worker is currently not employed. Then endogenous separation happens in the sense that the firm specifies hiring and firing thresholds and then lays off any worker that is below the firing threshold. And when it comes to hiring, the firm then hires a third-party agency that actually just engages in interviewing the workers for the firm. And once you're interviewed, the productivity level of that worker is actually materialized. Then production happens and wages are paid out. Now let's talk a little bit more about the labor market. So as we mentioned earlier, we have
before you do so, Michael, let me remind you that you have another 10 minutes to go.
Okay, perfect. So let me just briefly talk a little bit about how hiring and firing is actually happening. So the firm each period specifies a hiring and firing thresholds indicated by A upper and A lower bar. And those are endogenous, just determined, whether it's profitable to hire or profitable to fire a worker. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, of course, because there's a hiring cost, the hiring threshold is above the firing threshold. And now let me just tell you a little bit something about aggregate flows in the labor market. So the beginning of period unemployment rate after exogenous separation happens. So we have a unit interval of workers between 0 and 1. So you start off from 1, subtract everyone that was exogenously separated from the employed of last period. Then overall hiring in period T is just everyone that happens to be above the hiring threshold out of the pool of unemployed. And so here I should maybe just briefly mention that the agency observed if a given worker was endogenously separated. This means, of course, it's not profitable to hire an endogenously separated worker, so we only actually recruit out of the pool of the exogenously separated unemployed. And then total employment N is just effectively, who is hired, who was in the previous period employed, didn't get exogenously separated, and didn't get endogenously separated. Now, we briefly already introduced the third-party agency. So at the beginning of the period, this agency then just actually is told by the firm to hire workers that are above a certain threshold, and they are paid a fee per worker hired. Now, one thing I briefly want to mention is that given actually, so the fee, the way it was structured, I don't think I have it on the slide. So there is a fixed amount of work that it takes to interview a single person, and then the firm has to pay the agency this amount of work times the wage rate. Now, of course, you are compensated if you're an agency per worker hired, so therefore it is actually in fact increasing the amount you have to pay to the agency if the threshold you specify is higher, because all else equal, it will take more interviews to be performed. And then, just to make sure that we have output equals consumption, the money that the agency earns is just removed from the economy. Now, intermediate good firms, they are all identical in the sense that they have common technology, fully flexible prices, and the way they set also the hiring and firing thresholds are identical. So let's first focus on the firing threshold. At the threshold, the firm has to be indifferent between hiring and firing. So what does it mean? So, the wage you would have to pay to retain the worker has to be equal to the output the marginal worker at the threshold would produce, plus the option value of not having to hire in the future periods, where P is the price index of intermediate goods. At the firing threshold, the firm has to be indifferent between hiring a new worker and not hiring. So what does it mean to hire a new worker? The new worker also is paid the wage, and that's the amount the firm has to pay the hiring agency. And again, that's the output that you would get from hiring that worker, and the option value. And the option value effectively is just the amount of money you save of not having to pay the hiring agency in the future, take into account exogenous and endogenous separation in future periods. Then we have final goods firms that effectively just aggregate intermediates with sticky prices, and a Taylor rule with interest rate smoothing. Now, in the remaining 4 or 5 minutes that I have, I want to just briefly show you a couple of impulse response functions to an expansionary one standard deviation monetary policy shock. So what you have here on the y-axis is just the log deviations from steady state, and the different lines indicate, in blue, let's maybe first focus on that. It's our baseline calibration, where we just say that everyone in steady state that has a type above 0.5 is actually employed. What you see, expansionary monetary policy shock leads to a decrease in the hiring and in the firing threshold. Wages go up, interest rates go down. As we said, we have an expansionary shock, and inflation actually goes up on impact somewhat. Now, what you also see here in this figure, if you compare the red to the black line, so red means it's a high steady state hiring threshold, meaning it's a slack labor market. Black means it's the tight labor market. There we calibrate the steady state hiring threshold to 0.3. You see a substantially more larger and more persistent decrease in hiring and firing thresholds to the same expansionary monetary policy shock, which indicates that in the setup, in which is actually in fact cheaper to recruit because it takes less interviews to hire a single worker. You see in that setting that it is actually more beneficial for, I don't know, call it low types through the lens of the model to be more likely to be hired and less likely to be fired. And that's effectively what we, I don't know, try to convey here in this plot. So instead of looking at steady state, percentage deviations from steady state, we just actually first convert those movements and thresholds into levels, and then just do a very simple thought experiment. Think about everyone between 0 and a third, call that low type, between a third and 2/3, the middle type, and 2/3 and 1 on the unit interval, that's a high type. And then we just plot the fraction of those types that are employed over time, and I should mention this is actually in quarters, across the different calibration of the steady state hiring threshold. And what you see is, unless you have a really high threshold, the employment of the high types is pretty much insensitive to monetary policy, but you also see that if you look at the low type, they only benefit in tight labor markets and actually most sensitive to expansionary policy in tight labor markets. So 2 more figures I want to briefly mention. So here, there has been lots of discussion of whether the Phillips curve is hibernating, disappearing, become flatter, and so on. So we just thought that, given that also in the context of the policy review last year, this somewhat played a role, whether a flatter Phillips curve might potentially also, result in, I don't know, less the pressure to preemptively increase rates once inflation is on the horizon. And just a simple way of getting at that, we just actually jumped up a little bit the degree of price stickiness in the model, resulting in a flatter Phillips curve. And at least through the lens of the simple model, you see that if you have a high degree of price stickiness in red versus a low degree of price stickiness in dashed black, you see that there's some evidence that the hiring thresholds is actually more persistently declining, and the same for the firing thresholds, which would, if you have the previous figure in mind, suggest actually more benefits for low types and tight labor markets. The last thing here, let me just briefly mention it. So here we just substitute out the Taylor rule with the average inflation targeting. That's a way similar to Svensson. Effectively just actually add in current and the past 7 legs of inflation in your Taylor rule. And here you see that, given that we have 0 steady state inflation, it only kicks in after a certain period, that the decline is more persistent if you have AIT relative to a strict inflation target. So let me wrap up. So what we try to do in the paper is, both theoretically and empirically try to understand whether monetary policy has potential differential effects of different subpopulations, and whether local labor market tightness is a mediating factor of this effect. And indeed, we actually find that parts of the labor force that all else equal unconditionally seem to have a lower average attachment to the labor market. They seem to benefit most in terms of employment growth in tight labor markets relative to slack labor markets. We didn't find any differential employment growth empirically for higher attachment subpopulations. And then we wrote down a simple Keynesian model to try to understand that. And here, I was rushing over that a little bit, but it also seems that average inflation targeting potentially could in fact actually benefit less attached workers. And so, we have nothing to say about welfare or optimal policy in this work, but obviously those are super interesting questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much for various reasons, for volunteering to take the slots and for a great presentation. Now, first, let me give you a bit of great news. Yuri is alive. And apparently, mixing of time zones in online conferences can happen to the best of us, so we can all feel better about ourselves too. Since we had Michael present here, Yuri is going to take his slot and will be the second paper in the monetary economics and fluctuations session later today. With that, let's go to the Q&A for this paper, and let me do my duty of kicking this off. So, a question about the model and how to think of the relationship between the model and your results. In that, your results only tell us that monetary policy benefits, Blacks and women in particular, and non-college educated workers, especially when the labor market is tight. But that's all of it. The model actually has a causal mechanism that it's because these people are less productive. And for non-college education people, that might be the case. But for women and Blacks, that's probably not correct as a blanket statement. And my question is whether it will make a lot of, in terms of optimal policy, in terms of policy recommendations, it will clearly make a difference. But in terms of just positive predictions, would it make a difference if the results were more driven by blatant discrimination or by perhaps higher reservation wages for some groups of people?
Actually, that's an excellent point, and actually shame on me then the lack of time. I didn't elaborate on that. So like we are pretty explicit in the paper and mentioned it multiple points. Like we model, this is just a modeling device for us. You could think of it on the one hand, either also like rather than actual productivity differences, like a perceived productivity on the side of the firm, or even actually like differences in productivity. We could think of it like identically a differential degree of discrimination of different types, and firms would first hire, I don't know, their preferred type and then other types. So I think, in terms of like the way we would then have to define output, of course, would be a bit tricky, and we would have to think a little bit about that. But right now for us, this is mainly like, coming up with a way of potentially modeling these differences, but certainly we actually don't want to take those literally, for sure.
All right, and then we have Esther Faya.
Yeah, I mean, part of my question was aligned to Refat, meaning that, I wouldn't think, all of those, I think, first of all, the paper is very interesting and it's very cool, like all of Michael's papers. So, I wouldn't think of all those groups being aligned by the same characteristics being productivity. They probably have different, Refat said reservation wages, they probably have different participation constraints. So typically for women, there is the added worker effect that when monetary policy changes and financing condition within the families change, typically they add themselves to the labor force of the family. So there are probably very much reservation wages effect. I don't think, like Refat is saying, that there are discrimination effects, because the discrimination wouldn't change over the cycle, or at least it wouldn't change in response to monetary policy. So, I think you can fairly say that, if there's discrimination, is fairly flat. But certainly there might be a labor supply effect, which you might want to maybe address with using the JOLTS data.
Nice. I actually really like, first your question, comment, and then also like definitely like looking actually at whether labor supply actually might differ. So something else. At some point we've thought a little bit of potentially also, in general, like whether the labor supply elasticities across different types actually might matter. I think the way I would have interpreted Refat's question could be like, I as an employer, maybe, if I have the choice, I prefer to hire the type that that looks similar to me, and only once I don't have another choice anymore. So in tight labor markets, I would also, potentially hire someone else. I think that could be a way of potentially thinking about it, and that's how we at least think about it in the paper. But totally, I think like, even like this idea, and I haven't actually anyone's seen modeling that, like, within a household, that once you have loose policy, that this alleviates financial constraints, and then you could potentially, I don't know, hire babysitters or whatever, and to then actually enter the labor force. I think that's actually quite interesting. If you have actually a reference, this would be.
There are papers by Chris Flynn and Daniela Del Boca, yes. It's the outward working effect. Yeah, I mean, I can come upstairs afterwards.
Okay. So, just for clarification, Esther and I, we don't share a house. We are currently in the same building.
All right, very good. Let me continue on this then. I slightly disagree with Esther on discrimination. I'm sure there's a literature on this that I don't know, but I could think of discrimination as a non-pecuniary benefit in a perverted way to the discriminator. And when demand is too high, it becomes a very expensive luxury. And then I could see discrimination having differential effects over the cycle. But that brings me to another question. And then I see Francesco is next, which is there anything specific to monetary policy here? Because it seems like this is purely a demand story, right? And if so, you probably can find other demand shocks and show that demand shocks affect these, let's call them underprivileged groups, and hopefully this is the right language. But these things have heterogeneous effects, and it's not just monetary policy. Or is it that, no, there's something specific to monetary policy because it's the relaxation of, for example, the bank's constraints, and it's the firms that are more bank dependent who are more likely to hire these people. And it's only then that if you have pushed them sufficiently, relax that constraint sufficiently, that it benefits. I'd be very interested to know whether this is any demand shock or there's anything specific to the monetary policy shocks here.
No, yeah, those are additional great thoughts. We thought a little bit about that, and so at least something I didn't really talk about today. It's like it looks like the employment effect is actually building up over time. And one way to thinking about it, for us at least, was to also think that maybe it takes persistently specifically tight labor markets, which might actually give, based on some of Fiori's work with Olli and I think Lawrence, like expansionary policy leads to tight labor markets, and it might take actually persistently expansionary policy or low for longer to sufficiently tighten labor markets that then will actually translate into higher employment growth of the least attached parts of the labor force. But I think this is certainly on our to-do list to potentially also look at other demand shocks, whether they would operate through in a similar way. Totally.
Let me throw in one more before stopping. But have you looked at this symmetry or asymmetry of this? That is, conditional on having found a job at a very tight labor market because the Fed was gracious enough to further ease. Do I think that as a non-college educated Black woman, I will be the first to let go when rates go up? Or is it actually a unobserved productivity story where once the match is done and I've shown what a great hire I am, I actually am more likely to keep my job?
My understanding of the literature, and so here I'm unfortunately not an expert, is like there seems to be like leased in, first out type unconditionally, but we haven't looked at that empirically conditional monetary policy shocks that I think could be quite interesting indeed. And so we definitely can look into that for sure.
All right, and Francesco?
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask a question that is kind of so obvious that I have a suspicion you must already have answered it. So if you have, just stop me, okay? Don't let me make a total fool of myself. Which is this, and it goes about the same topic that you've been discussing with Refet and Esther, which is what does the racial indicator really capture in your regressions? I mean, there's clearly no, obviously the category of education and race and gender, they're not mutually exclusive. And equally, obviously, I think the low education incidence is much higher among the certain racial groups than others. And so clearly, it seems obvious to me that one question that comes up is, are you showing us the same result in 3 different ways, or at least in 2 different ways, meaning that your racial dummy is only capture, again, the low education dummy. And so it seems like the obvious thing to do would have been to run this with finer groups, not black and white and non-low education and high education, but black and low education, black and high education, white and low education, and white and high education. And then we could actually more intelligently talk about whether there is residual black effect over and above the education effect. So that's kind of obvious exercise. Have you done it?
Yeah, so I was brushing over that, I think, verbally earlier during the presentation. So like, at least at the level of granularity we look at, we can't really do that, because once you have those 900 local labor markets within 4-digit NAICS codes, and then you want to compare interactions between, let's say, race and education, you have like always less than 50 observation in each cell. So this doesn't work anymore. I think what we could do, however, is just aggregate up a little bit, either less granular industries or less granular localities. So like maybe just one thing I want to briefly mention is like, the identification we get is always kind of fixed a certain type and compare across slack versus tight labor market. So like, at least unconditional differences, including differences in education for other groups, should be taken care of. So it would have to be like an additional interaction effect. That's all I'm saying.
All right. Any other questions? Very good. So Lydia, would you keep us here, all of us here, for 10 minutes and then send us to the breakout rooms in the middle of the break period? We're now going to have a break where some of us will be here just chatting, and then at 20 to the hour, we will be sent to our breakout rooms where we don't immediately start the presentations. That's for chatting in smaller groups as well. And 10 to the hour, we'll start the presentations.